you point out to people, well, nobody's doing anything about boys in education. People will respond with things like, well, it's their own fault. They're too laddish. They muck about. They think they can rest on their laurels because they're going to earn more anyway eventually. And anyway, male privilege, they can rely on that. They will trot out these things. You can read things like excuses like that, even in government reports, appallingly. So again, that's the empathy gap. Excusing male disadvantages on the basis that in some form it's their own fault.
Today on British Thought Leaders, I sit down with Rick Bradford. Rick has had a successful career in physics and engineering and is an honorary senior research fellow at the University of Bristol. He's also a world-renowned authority on men's issues, writing under the pseudonym William Collins. His 2019 book, The Empathy Gap, is a comprehensive collection of evidence arguing that men are extensively disadvantaged across many areas of life. I'm Lee Hall and this is British Thought Leaders. Rick Bradford, thanks for joining us on British Thought Leaders.
It's my pleasure to be here. I must say it's flattering to be considered a British thought leader, so let's hope I can live up to it.
Before we dive into your book, you've had a successful career in physics, engineering. Could you tell us a bit about how you got interested in men's issues and also why you chose to write under a different name?
Yeah, the first of those questions, it really goes back a long, long way to the early 80s, at least, when I first became a little disturbed by what to me was a very obvious skew in the narrative, that was being promulgated by mainstream media, newspapers and so on. So I found that niggling, and then in the early 90s there was a slew of books came out, one by Neil Linden called No More Sex War in 1992, and then the following year Warren Farrell's Myth of Male Power and David Thomas's Not Guilty came out. And they were all on this theme of the narrative was very skewed in one direction in terms of gender. And I was onto those books straight away. So clearly in the early 90s I was beginning to get seriously interested. But at that time, of course, I had a full-time job, a very demanding career. I was raising a family. I didn't have time to do more than be concerned, but didn't do anything about it. But when I retired, I started blogging on the issue because by then I'd become even more concerned because it was getting even worse, I thought. So that was the origin of it. It really goes back a long way. And why would I be concerned? Well, it's just living as a man in this society that... why would you not be? I think the issue is not why you would be concerned, but why you would be so concerned to start writing about it. Or to put it the other way around, why are most people, or not most people perhaps, but a lot of people concerned but don't talk about it? And that's of course because one side of the story is approved and one side of the story is not approved. So it takes a certain degree of nerve to actually put your head above the parapet and start talking about these things. And that, of course, is part of the reason why I chose a pseudonym, because I started blogging for many years before I started writing the book. In fact, I didn't really have an intention to write a book initially. I was just content with blogging. And, of course, on the internet it's common to use a pseudonym, especially if you're talking about these sort of contentious issues where you can easily have a mob descend upon you. So it's a matter of self-protection. And then some years later, when I wrote the book, I adopted the same pseudonym because by then I had a modest following, not a huge, but a modest following on the internet. So it was natural to continue with that pseudonym. No one would have bought the book at all if I'd published it in my own name. Whereas as it was, at least I could reach a small audience with that pseudonym.
It's Pride and Prejudice, isn't it?
It is, and well done, because most people don't pick that up. I've known English professors fail to pick that up.
English graduate.
It is, yes. It's the socially inept vicar in Pride and Prejudice, which seemed appropriate.
So I think the term mind-blowing is kind of thrown around these days and used a bit too freely, but reading your book, I think it's a fair description to call it that. It's basically 900 pages of evidence saying that men and boys are disadvantaged, particularly in the UK. Could you tell us your opinion? You've done all this evidence, you've done all this research. What's your opinion on the situation for men and boys in the UK?
Well, clearly, I don't think it's very good, or I wouldn't have written the book. I'm gratified in a way that you find it mind-blowing, because it means it was worth writing. And you're by no means the only person to have that reaction to it, because, of course, this is the story that's not told. So people are not acquainted with the facts. So that's the issue here, that because the mainstream media don't promulgate these things, people are in ignorance of it. Because whilst I, perhaps because of my background in a numerical discipline, I was driven to look at the data, because one of the things I first asked myself when I thought, well, I'm going to start blogging now, is the real motivation there was, is it me? Have I got the wrong end of the stick? I mean, what's the evidence? You know, being a scientist, I thought, what is the evidence? Perhaps I am just a horrible old misogynist and I've got it all wrong. And that's really why I started. And the blog was a means of communicating what I found when I started doing that. And it didn't take me long to realise that actually the evidence was very emphatic, remarkably so. So, yeah, the situation is not good, because it's getting worse. That's the real issue. And the book's called The Empathy Gap for a reason. It's called The Empathy Gap because there is a muted empathy towards males in society. And it's important to understand that this originates from both men and women. It's not that one sex is lacking in empathy towards men, it's both. And this is why the whole issue is rather hidden, because there's an innate proclivity to minimise harms to men and boys compared with those to females. It's of evolutionary origin. So does that get some way to answering your question about the position? I mean, in terms of the contents of the book, which perhaps I should try and itemise what the book entails in terms of subject matter, just to give viewers a clue as to the broad scope of it. Apart from the first chapter, which is rather theoretical, the rest of it is a massive exercise in presenting evidence, as I've just described. So there's just short of 1,000 references. There's, I think, 179 figures, which mostly means graphs, and 49 numerical tables. So every chapter is stuffed full of data. And I'm using data that is national statistics wherever possible. So from the Office for National Statistics, Ministry of Justice, Home Office, official sources wherever possible, and failing that, academic studies published in peer-reviewed journals wherever possible. So it's good data. Sometimes you have to have recourse to slightly less data of slightly less provenance, but in general, it's high-quality data. And I cover 12 broad subject areas. I'm probably going to miss one or two out if I try itemising them. Let me attempt the list. So it goes health and longevity, education, pay, jobs, pay, spending, tax and pensions in one big chapter. Then I'll look at criminal justice and the bias against men in the criminal justice system. Then domestic abuse. Actually, domestic abuse is one of the things I looked at first. And also I looked at violence generally in society. Then there's the whole slew of parental separation issues, which is almost certainly the most egregious area because it impacts on children as well. So there it's the operation of the family courts, the phenomenon of parental alienation, and the knock-on effects of our culture now in terms of creating fatherlessness, and that's how the impact on the children is so severe. And also paternity rights, the issue of paternity fraud, and issues associated with men's limited control over their own fertility, which is an issue that's given very little airing. Then I go on to look at homelessness, which is that is one area which people are aware that in terms of rough sleepers, it's mostly men that are affected. You can see that on the streets. Then suicide and mental health, mental ill health, of course. And again, suicide is an area which is becoming more prominent as being chiefly a men's issue. And then finally, sexual assault. And the two final chapters are on sexual assault. One on the story that's most commonly told, which is where women are the victims, but the other, the story less told, where men and children are the victims, and sometimes women are the perpetrators. So I think I could say that every chapter will challenge most people's credulity. As you say, it's mind-blowing. But the closing chapter on sexual assault is perhaps the most challenging of all for the public, because there you have to acknowledge, or I have acknowledged, that there is such a thing as male sexual abuse of adult men by women, which most people find really, really mind-blowing. But it's a real thing, but it's submerged. It's something that's not really brought to light very much. So that gives you a quick whistle-stop tour of the subject matter. A couple of things I'd add to that, which are very important before we sort of continue into the details. The first is that you might get the impression that I'm looking at these things because I'm a man with a chip on my shoulder, that I've been hurt in some way. That is emphatically not the case. Despite all the writing I've done about male disadvantages, I've personally not suffered from any of them. So I've not been mistreated in the family courts, or had, messy custody battles, or had false accusations, or any of these things. None of them applies to me, so I'm actually one of the lucky ones. So although this probably sounds incredibly pious, my motivation is actually moral obligation, because once you start to become aware of the reality of these issues and the scope of them and the seriousness of them and what they're now doing in terms of driving division in our society, it becomes a moral obligation not to be silent, because if you're silent, you're complicit. So I did say earlier you have to be a bit brave to talk about these things, but I'm not a very brave man, to be honest. And perhaps that's why I chose the pseudonym originally. But I simply could not live with myself if I did not at least try doing something in terms of blogging and writing books. So that's one very important thing to get clear. The other thing is people may mistake my motivation as trying to make a play in what's now called the victimhood Olympics, which has become a very popular thing in our society, to claim victimhood as a means of gaining essentially social or political power. Well, nothing could be further from my mind, because I profoundly disapprove of victimhood as a mechanism for achieving influence. I think it's fundamentally wrong, and it's particularly wrong for men, because it's simply not the masculine way to be a crybaby. Essentially, it's not. So I'm emphatically not trying to make a play in the victimhood Olympics on behalf of men. It would be foolish to try to do that anyway, because men have been disenfranchised from the sort of empathy that is required to make victimhood work anyway. So I just want to make those 2 points before we get into the details, because it's very important to bear in mind the motivation here. It's not that.
So society now is saturated, if you like, by the message that the patriarchy is oppressing women and men are toxic, etc. Your book starts with the sentence of disadvantages or inequalities suffered by men and boys are substantial and to be found across all aspects of life. Basically the opposite of what we're kind of told in society. How has society got it so wrong, and how do we end up at this point?
Yeah, it starts with that sentence and then it continues with 700 pages of evidence that in fact that is correct. That's the point of the book, of course. But the question you're asking there, and it's the right question, is why does society think something so radically different than what is empirically justifiable? And that's, of course, where the empathy gap comes in. Because the empathy gap hides it. It makes these things invisible by its nature. So just to repeat, I've talked about the empathy gap before, but let me reiterate what the empathy gap is. It's a muted empathy towards males if they're placed in the very same situation where a woman would receive or a girl would receive greater empathy. So in the identical situation, there's a muted empathy towards males. And it's of evolutionary origin, that's the point. It's very ancient. But it's also culturally intensified. And it's been culturally intensified, particularly over the last 50 or 60 years, due to the rise of feminism, essentially. So this concept is not new. You can actually give it many different names. In academic psychology, for example, it's closely related to the concept of gamma bias. And I'll not attempt a full academic definition of gamma bias, but one aspect of gamma bias is that it involves just that. If you place a man and a woman, or a boy and a girl, in the same situation of potential harm or actual harm, then that is seen as far more grievous if it's a female potentially suffering the harm. In other words, it's more acceptable to put men in the way of harm than women in the way of harm. And this is a fairly well-established principle in psychology. And we see that play out in many different ways. In everyday life, in terms of work, what's called the dad's jobs, dirty and dangerous jobs, are men's jobs. Going on the roof and fixing the roof tiles is a man's job, and going down the sewers and cleaning the sewers is a man's job, and so forth. And of course, still being put in the way of danger in wartime is, at the front, is still primarily a man's role and always has been.
So if we can dive into some of the evidence, obviously there's 900 pages of it, we're not going to go through it all here, but I was hoping you could give us kind of a top 5 or just what you feel are the kind of most important areas that people need to know about.
Yeah, it's probably the parental issues are the most important because they impact on children. But let me give a few examples. We'll perhaps get to that one. I could talk on this for a week, of course. Let me just start in the order that I listed them and see where we get to.
Right.
And one thing I want you to bear in mind here is that the way in which the empathy gap manifests itself very often is in that every time you try and draw attention to a male disadvantage, you go through a sort of familiar sequence of, first of all, just people who don't know the facts, so you have to convince them that you're giving them the real facts, even though they're incredulous to begin with. And then if you can get over that barrier, the whole sequence of processes that you go through, denial is one of them and justification is another. But one of the familiar responses is, well, it's their own fault. And you'll see that illustrated throughout all these examples. It's their own fault. Because as long as any male disadvantage can be blamed upon the man, or the boy for that matter, then there's no need for society to take any action. And that's really what society is trying to do here, is to protect itself from having to squander resources on the sex that doesn't need it so badly. So if we start off with health and longevity, probably most people are aware that on average men die younger. So the longevity gap is typically about 4 years. It actually varies with socioeconomics, so there's a bigger gender gap in the lower socioeconomic groups. So in other words, being poor impacts men more. However, that sort of raw fact is just the tip of an iceberg here, because the real issue is how much more the death rate of men is greater than that of women, or boys over girls, at every age until most men are dead. And this starts in the womb. You know, male fetuses are more likely to abort than female fetuses. And then babies, male babies are more likely to die than girl babies. Boys, same thing. Young men, same thing. All the way through at every age until the age of 83, when more than half of men are dead. So, for example, men are 43% more likely to die prematurely, which I define as death before the age of 75. And they're 79%, a massive 79% more likely to die before the age of 45.
Really?
It's a huge, huge difference. So the 4-year longevity gap, people can say, oh, well, it's not terribly important, especially since you visualise that, of course, of being at the end of your life when you're old anyway, and you think it's not so important. But the point that they miss is this massive difference in death rate throughout life. For young men, it's about 3 times more than women. But that's the rash young man effect, you know, taking undue risks and driving too fast and things like that. But, well, 45, the leading cause of death in men, of course, is suicide. But beyond that, beyond 45, the leading cause of death in both sexes are cardiovascular diseases and cancers. And men, excluding the sex-specific cancers, men die more men than women die of every single cancer, every single type of cancer. So it isn't just men being... Well, yeah, the reaction to that very often, as I say, the reaction is his own fault. People will say to that, oh, well, men don't look after themselves. They smoke too much, they drink too much, you know, they don't go and see the doctor when they should, and so on. Well, there may be an element of that. Certainly lifestyle has an impact on cardiovascular diseases and cancers, that's for sure. But it's true, that's true in both sexes. When you actually look at the evidence, it's absolutely clear there's also a biological effect. And that's why I stress that this difference in death rate starts in the womb, babies, young boys. It is partly biological. There may be lifestyle issues as well, but it's certainly a biological issue as well. It may well be because testosterone is an immune suppressant, plays part of the issue. So there's definitely a biological component, and such things as, well, men don't go and see the doctor as much as they should. Well, it's sort of true, but then when you drill into the data, you find that, yeah, women see the doctor more often, but that's because they're going to see the doctor about pregnancy issues and contraception issues and antenatal issues and various scans that women have that men don't have. So there's reasons there why they are seeing the doctor more. And the other part of that is that more men are working full-time and finding it hard to make an appointment. So if you actually take all those things into account, there isn't so much difference. So, yeah, so there's a massive difference there. But the empathy gap really shows up when you look at the political level on this. So, for example, our chief medical officer that was a few years ago was Sally Davis. And when she was holding that office, she produced a report called the health of the 51% women. Well, that's fair enough. I have no problems with that. But a number of us wrote to her saying, well, are you going to produce, a report on the health of men? And she declined to do so. And you're just left wondering, well, why? Why, given the clear evidence that it's even more required than for women? But you don't get an explanation. Another example of that at the political level is last November, when there was a debate in the House of Commons on International Men's Day. And Maria Caulfield, who is, amongst various other roles, the Under-Secretary of State for Women's Health Strategy, because there is a women's health strategy, but you guessed it, there's not a men's health strategy. So she was there, probably out because she had to, because they have to have a minister present at debates. And it's actually telling that at all these International Men's Day debates, it's always the Minister for Women that comes, despite the fact it's a Men's Day debate, because, of course, there's no Minister for Men. So she was challenged, not unreasonably, well, why isn't there a men's health care strategy? And her answer is a perfect illustration of the empathy gap. She said, well, women spend more time in poor health than men, which is why we have a women's healthcare strategy and not a men's healthcare strategy. But if you examine that answer, knowing what we know, the reason, of course, for that, I mean, assuming it's true that women spend more time in poor health, I don't doubt it, but the reason would be that women live longer. So, of course, they spend more time in ill health. So, actually, a logical corollary of that same statement is we're not having a men's health strategy because they die younger. And when you express it like that, it's just gobsmacking. That it's such a blatant, well, frankly, prejudice. I'm sure Maria Caulfield was not being consciously callous, but actually, if you're immersed in these issues from the empathy gap perspective, as I am, it comes across as incredibly callous. So that's a perfect illustration of how the empathy gap works in practice. So that's a quick guided tour around healthcare. And that's just one of the 12 issues, and probably one of the easier ones to tackle. I could talk now about education. So it's common knowledge now amongst the public that boys are not doing well in education. So a number of people over the years have raised freedom of information enquiries with the Department for Education to ask them what they're doing about this. And the answer that always comes back in some form of words or another is nothing. And again, it's just like it was for the men's health strategy issue. You don't really get a cogent explanation of that. It's just they think they can say nothing and that's the end of the matter, as if there's no issue here, but of course there is an issue. Because boys are falling behind more and more each year. And I'm 68. When I was at school, boys did better than girls. Not at primary school. Girls always did better at primary school. But as you went through the older ages, boys probably caught up round about what was then O-levels. And by A-levels, boys were doing better. But now, the opposite happens. Boys start off behind, and as they go through the schooling, they get more and more and more behind. So by the time you get to university, we're now finding that the number of women starting undergraduate courses each year exceeds the number of men by about 37%. So it's a big gap. Women have actually been the majority of undergraduates in the UK for 30 years. So this is not new. This has been going on for a long time. Now, I don't necessarily have any problem with that per se, but the narrative is the narrative is skewed one way, and I think people are not grasping how potentially serious this is in terms of the ultimate impact on the economy because now at university level, women are dominating in 73% of subjects. They even dominate now, and actually have done for a long time, for about 16 years, women have dominated in the pure sciences, which most people, that's another one of the things that people will think is all right. Yeah, it is right, because although men dominate, say, in physics, women dominate very emphatically in biology and psychology, and that and it's probably on a par in chemistry. And so overall, women dominate in the pure sciences. And the really godsmacking one here is women dominate in STEM. I am spelling STEM here with two M's, S-T-E-M-M. So it's science, technology, engineering, maths, medicine and subjects allied to medicine. So the reason why women dominate in STEM with two M's is because they dominate in the S, the pure sciences, and they dominate in medicine and subjects allied to medicine in a big way. So men still dominate in the T, the E and the first M, technology, engineering and maths. But that, together with architecture, they're the only four subjects men now dominate in. Women dominate in everything else. And to a really emphatic degree in most subjects now. So, for example, law, there's twice as many women. Psychology, 4 times as many women. Languages, 3 times as many women. Medicine itself, about 80% more women. Agricultural sciences is my favourite, because you'd think that would be dominated by men, because farmers are men, aren't they? No, it's massively dominated by women. Veterinary science, 6 times more women. 6 times, yeah. But of course they all want to do small animal work, which means pets, not cows and horses and sheep, unfortunately, which has a greater impact on the economy. Teaching, 6 times more women. And of course nursing must be something like 10 times more women. So it's really, really emphatic. And you can summarise that by saying, with the one exception, which is maths, in subjects where men still dominate, the gender gap is getting smaller. Perhaps only slowly, but it is getting smaller. Whereas in all the subjects where women dominate, the gender gap is getting bigger. So the situation is getting worse year on year. And yet there's no will to do anything about it. It seems we can keep on going and ignore the issue, but it will have an impact on the economy, especially now that's being allied to the EDI policy, so equality, diversity, inclusivity, in employment, which frankly is a way of advantaging everybody except able-bodied heterosexual white males. So that's only going to make it worse. I mean, if you have a hard enough time struggling through the education system as a man, and then find you're discriminated against when it comes to getting a job, then it's not going to be good. So that's the first 2 subjects. Where should we go from there? I suppose we've got to look at the parental issue, because that has got to be the most egregious, really. The difficulty here is you can't talk about parental separation without also talking about domestic abuse. And logically, those 2 things should be completely separate, but they're not. And partly they're not separate because the prevalence of domestic abuse amongst separating couples is 8 times higher than the prevalence amongst stable married couples. Whether that's because the abuse causes the separation or the separation causes the abuse, I don't know. I think it'll be partly one, partly the other, but I've never seen any data to disaggregate between the two. It'd be very interesting to see that, if anybody gets any. But what's undoubtedly the case is it's a very high level of domestic abuse in separating couples. So you can't separate those issues. And that's of great relevance when it comes to the family courts, because the family courts, of course, are they have as their priority the best interest of the child. Whether they actually fulfil that obligation is another matter, but that's what their obligation should be and what they try to work towards. So if there's been an allegation that this man, or possibly this woman, is abusive, then it's a matter that they have to take seriously. So what that has the effect of is that allegations of abuse in the family courts, if you're a belligerent parent and if you're separating, it means, generally speaking, you're not getting on very well with your ex-partner. I think we can be fairly sure of that. And very often people will go into the family courts. If they're the resident parent, they will very often go in with the mindset, I'm not letting that bastard see his kids ever again. That's a common mindset. So if they go in with that mindset and they have this way gifted to them of delivering that, what they wish, in terms of them maintaining sole control over the children and denying contact to what is usually the father, because fathers are 92 to 95% of non-resident parents. The result of that is 50% of so-called Children Act, private law, family law cases, in other words, basically cases about child contact. 50% involve allegations. It's a massive, massive percentage. And the thing that's exacerbated this situation was that in April 2013, the Legal Aid Sentencing and Punishing of Offenders Act came into force. And one of the things that act does is it withdraws, it removes legal aid from civil court cases, which therefore includes the family courts, except if domestic abuse arises. So, who would have thought that because of that ruling about the exception for domestic abuse, in other words, because the allegation of domestic abuse can provide legal aid where it would not otherwise be available, who would have guessed that that might drive up the number of allegations? Well, I think a child of 10 could have guessed that, but unfortunately not our criminal justice system, or family court justice system in this case. So we saw between just before and just after April 2013, the percentage of legal aid granted to men in the family courts decrease from 40% to 15%. And we saw the number of so-called non-molestation orders, that's the orders that are raised to protect victims from domestic abuse. We saw that increase over that same time period. So there's no doubt that there is a strategic advantage to making allegations. That's not to say, of course, that all allegations are false. They won't be. Some will be true. And herein lies the great difficulty of the family courts. Family courts, of course, come into great criticism, and rightly so, because they don't do a very good job. But one has to acknowledge that they've been handed a hospital pass. They've been given a job which is virtually impossible, because they have to try and sort out, amongst allegations and counter-allegations, where the best interest of the child really lies. And I think at least some enlightened judges are aware of the fact, and it is a fact, that children do best if they have contact with both parents. But it's a very difficult thing for them to decide, because who's to know where the truth lies? So very often, and you can hardly blame them, they err on the side of caution. And so men are, because it is men that are generally the ones that are subject to the allegations, essentially put in the position of having to prove that they're safe with their own children. And, well, of course, some may be abusive, so there is an issue. It's not that there's no issue. But I know, because I am a trustee of a charity which assists non-resident parents. So we see north of 600 registrants per year, and we hear their stories. And so I know from the stories that we're hearing, and hearing the same stories over and over and over and over again, that false allegations are certainly rife, and you get men that are perfectly innocent facing really, really egregious allegations like rape or child sexual molestation that are complete fabrications. And it makes it very, very difficult for them to get contact with the children. So that is the origin of what we now see or that's partly the origin of what we now see in society, the contagious fatherlessness. So it's parental separation that does it. It's not just divorce, by the way. It's also people that were never married, cohabiting couples. Cohabiting couples are actually now the chief source of family breakdown, because they split a lot more often than people that get married. So there's a lot to be said for marriage. We don't hear that being voiced very often, do we? Instead, we hear the mantra that, families come in all shapes and sizes. Well, that's a political mantra. It's not sociologically true that all families are equivalent, because children really do benefit from having the care of two parents. The sociological evidence is absolutely emphatic on that. But people do like to deny it for their own political purposes. So you have what is therefore a very difficult situation for men that undergo, particularly men, it can be women as well, but mostly men that undergo parental separation where the child contact is being denied. And so we come to suicide, don't we? Because those things are related, almost certainly. Because suicide is 3 to 4 times more prevalent in men than women, about 3 times in England, perhaps 4 times more in Wales. And this is common across the whole developed world. It's not unique to the UK. The ratio may be even worse in some countries.
Suicide is the biggest cause of death for men in the UK, isn't it?
It's the biggest cause of death under the age of 45. Once over 45, then the diseases of cancer and cardiovascular diseases become the leading cause. And then there are various other causes that become more predominant. But yes, the peak in suicide for men is in midlife. And surprise, surprise, it's in that time period between mid-30s and mid-40s where parental separation is most common. So one of the things which is really unforgivable, I find, is that the research on this has not really been done in the UK. The research on the causes of suicide has not really been done as it should be done. There is a certain amount of research, but it's very sparse. And every time the government makes money available to do research, I followed how that money, it progresses through tendering processes and somehow magically gets deflected away from the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room being men, and particularly men in midlife. It gets deflected away onto the fashionable causes. So it's suicide amongst LGBT and suicide amongst teenagers. And I'm not saying those things don't deserve recognition. Of course they do, as much as anything else. But there's an obvious demographic that needs it most, that it doesn't get the attention. So the research has not been done properly in the UK. I don't think it's really been done properly anywhere. But there is some evidence from abroad on the effects of divorce and parental separation. Not parental separation, just partnership dissolution, which isn't the same thing, on suicide rates. And that data is very clear that there is a relationship in terms of increasing suicide rate. And it's, a median of more than a factor of 2 and a mean of about 3.5 for men over their rate in the general population, which means that a man that's undergone separation is 8 to 12 times more likely to suicide than a woman that's not undergone separation, so a woman in the general population. So that's a massive factor. And even that is probably an underestimate, because that I don't think anyone has looked specifically at the issue of child contact. And it's actually I know from my charity work that it's child contact that is the killer for men, not so much the parental separation. It's the denial of access to their own children, which is the issue. And we see this, again, I mentioned the charity that I'm a trustee of. We have data from the charity which demonstrates this. I mean, I have hard data. We carry out psychological tests on the men that join us. We do standard psychology tests for mental well-being and emotional and social isolation, and the results are appalling. I mean, so much worse than the general public. It's just startling. I mean, just to give you an indication, if you look at loneliness, which social isolation, in other words, in the general population, you find that the most common level is no loneliness at all, people that are fine, and the least common level is the very highest level, severe loneliness. In our service users, which are non-resident fathers, the histogram is the other way around. So the most common is the severe loneliness level, and the least common is not lonely at all. It's absolutely emphatic. And the corollary of that is 28% of our service users have recently had suicidal ideation. 5.5% of our service users have attempted suicide. That's massively larger than in the general population. So there's no doubt that there is a very strong relationship here. And I could wax lyrical about the further data we get from our service users, but there's a lot of issues to cover here. Let me talk about the CMS, the child maintenance system. This is work not that I've done, but other people have done. People have raised freedom of information requests asking for the death rate amongst payees, people who are paying into the child maintenance. So the child maintenance system is the system whereby the non-resident parent pays in and the resident parent gets that money, and the CMS takes a small percentage. So we've got this death rate data, so the number of people paying in and how many have died in a given time, and similarly with the people receiving payment. And the death rate amongst payees is 2 to 3 times higher than the death rate amongst the same sex of the same age range in the general population. So that's bad straight away, 2 to 3 times higher, and you have to ask why. We don't know what the cause of death is. Our suspicion is, of course, that a lot of it is suicide, but we don't know. Don't know for sure. We just know that they're dying abnormally. Many of them are dying. But it gets worse when you and I emphasise this is other people's work, not mine. So this bit isn't in the book, but this is quite recent information. If you ask specifically about people who are in arrears, and I say people, it's overwhelmingly fathers, of course, people who are in arrears with the CMS, then the death rate goes up to 15 times in the general population. Yeah, even I was gobsmacked by that one. So there's a story here which is not emerging because the research hasn't been done, but the research could be done. It should be done. At the moment, these facts are being fished out by amateurs like me, because I'm an amateur in this field. Engineering is my background. And it shouldn't be done by amateurs. It should be done by professionals and backed by government money. And it's absolutely wicked that this is not happening. So CMS, child maintenance system, for me, CMS means cause of male suicide. So this whole situation is absolutely appalling. Perhaps that's enough now to give you the feel for it. But just on the theme of suicide before we close, I said one thing that's a recurring theme in whenever you point out male disadvantage. People do now recognise that men are suiciding at a faster rate than women. But whenever anyone mentions it in any public forum, you can be absolutely certain in the next breath they'll say, well, the reason is that men don't seek help, men don't open up about their feelings, men don't talk. That's what they'll trot out. They have no evidence for that. They have no empirical evidence that those things are the cause of male suicide. But they will trot those things out. And if you think about it, what those things are, they're all ways of saying it's the man's own fault. It's the man's own fault he didn't seek help. It's the man's own fault for being so macho he won't show his feelings. So it's that same manifestation of the empathy gap in the context of suicide. And it's the same in education, by the way, when you point out to people, well, nobody's doing anything about boys in education. People will respond with things like, well, it's their own fault. They're too laddish. They muck about. They think they can rest on their laurels because they're going to earn more anyway eventually. And anyway, male privilege, they can rely on that. They will trot out these things. You can read things like excuses like that, even in government reports, appallingly. So again, that's the empathy gap, excusing male disadvantages on the basis that in some form it's their own fault. You see it time and time again. So there's quite a few examples there. That's perhaps enough for one day. Otherwise, I'll have your viewers in a depressed mood. It's very easy to get depressed contemplating these things.
The one thing specifically I wanted to ask you about that's been quite a focus in society is this gender pay gap. I know you touch on it in the book. Is this a real thing?
It's real, and it's not at the same time. It's real, but it's a fine example of how you can... there's a phenomenon that I call constructive mendacity. This is when you can't actually point to something that was an actual lie. It's all sentence by sentence, it's all true. But what it amounts to is a cunning way of completely misleading the audience so that they gain completely the wrong impression. So it's a functional untruth, even though in a court of law you couldn't say they were lying. So yeah, the pay gap, let's drill into that. What people mean by the pay gap normally is the data that's gathered on employees, because it comes from something called ASH, which is based on the PAYE system. So it's only covering employees for a start. And you can disaggregate the massive data in a lot of different ways, but they generally look at people who are working full-time, and they focus on the pay gap between men and women across all ages. Now, if you look at that, there's a pay gap which is about 9%. Depends on whether you look at the mean or the median. It might be 6% or 9%, but somewhere around about there. So that's what they quote, and that's what they call the burning injustice against women. And they present that as women being paid less for the same work, which it isn't. I mean, it isn't, because they're not doing the same work. But there's all sorts of things you can say about that. Firstly, you don't get the same picture if you look at part-time working. The pay gap for part-time working is very little. Some years it's in favour of women, but it's very small, actually. But more importantly, if you look at the age distribution of the pay gap for people working full-time, it's very age-dependent. So below the age of about 40, there's no pay gap. Well, negligible, maybe a few percent, but in the level of statistical insignificance. The pay gap only kicks in late 30s, 40s. And the reason for that, everyone knows. Even people that push this agenda on the pay gap know what the reason is. The reason is that because at a certain point, women like work-life balance. They will tend to work part-time, especially when there's childcare issues. So if you've got a stable partnership, the man works full-time, the woman works part-time and does more of the looking after the children. So that is a typical way people voluntarily arrange their life. It's not anyone coercing them into it. And if you do things like the British social attitudes surveys have shown time and time again, that's what people want to do. Men are content with that, Women are content with that in general. Some people might not be, but the majority are. Overwhelming majority are, actually. So we know what drives that age-dependent pay gap. It's that women are going part-time. And so they don't progress through the seniority so much because they've gone part-time. They're no longer in the promotion stakes, perhaps. So that's what lies behind that. It's not really a big issue anyway, because 9% is not very much. That's a contentious statement. Compared to the other issues in the chapter in the book on this, because in that chapter I don't just look at pay. Well, I look for one thing at spending, because who cares about who gets paid what if you can spend more? And if you're in a couple, it's joint spending. It's joint spending, and very often you find the woman is actually responsible for spending more than half of the money because she's looking after the house and very often the woman looks after things like insurance and healthcare and what have you. So spending is an issue. It's difficult to get good data on spending, but a clue to who's spending more is advertising. If you look at adverts and who they're targeting at, unless it's very clearly a man's thing, you very often find they're targeting on women. And the advertisers know what their demographic is. So they will know if they're targeting women, it's because they've got more control of the money. So there's the issue of spending, but more, I don't care about that. I mean, it's fair enough. If you're living in a stable partnership, why should the woman, with a joint bank account, why should the woman not spend more? That's fine by me. But more egregious is that what's never exposed in this area is issues to do with tax and latterly pensions. Tax is the biggest one. One of the reasons why there is a pay gap in favour of men is men are doing more hours work. Men in the total hours worked amongst employees, 50% more by men. And it's because far more women work part-time. That's the reason. So men are working 50% more. On average, they get slightly more pay, but mostly they're getting a bigger take-home pay because they're putting more hours in. And because of that, men are paying 2.7 times more money into the exchequer in income tax. Now that is 170% tax gap, not 9%, 170% tax gap. That's why I say 90% is small in this context. That's a massive gap. Now, again, that's fine by me, if that's the way we want the system to be. And this is all part of male provisioning. It's all part of, if men are doing more work, earning more money, they should be putting more money into the exchequer. Fine. But it's never talked about. It's never talked about that is the other part of this story. And 170 is a hell of a lot bigger than 9. And then when you ask where that money's going, well, propping up the public sector is a large part of it. The major part of it, actually. And if you look at the public sector, who are the employees in the public sector? And the answer is 50%, more than double the employees in the public sector are women. There's twice as many women in the public sector employed than men. So you've got men paying massively disproportionately into the exchequer, and then in terms of the public sector, women benefiting from it far more. Now, again, I emphasise, I'm pointing out these issues not because I think there's necessarily anything wrong with that. What's wrong is the narrative that highlights one tiny little corner of this whole big picture, and it's a corner which is numerically teeny-weeny in comparison with the other aspects of the picture, which are all skewed in the opposite direction. So overall, constructive mendacity, I would say.
What kind of reaction have you had to your book, and why aren't people talking about all these things that you're talking about here?
Yes, there's a well-trodden path that people go down when they first come across these truths. I went down it. and I've known any number of other people go down it. When you first come across it, you think, well, first of all, you're relieving your own ignorance and finding things out, and turning over stones, and you're finding the same creepy crawlies under all of them. And so you become incredulous that this is the reality. And you think, well, I must tell everyone. I must tell everyone that this is what's going on, and then everyone will see that this is wrong and something will be done about it. So that's the first reaction. But then you go through the more difficult learning phase. The second phase is that you discover that no one really cares. In other words, you discover the empathy gap. You have a hard time even convincing people that the facts are the facts. For a start, people will deny it. So it's difficult to get over that barrier, just the ignorance barrier. But even if you do finally get over that barrier, you'll find that people are not very exercised by it in general. And that's the real problem here. It's the empathy gap. Is that it doesn't strike people as terribly wrong. And to some degree that's understandable, because to some degree it's just the way society is structured for that to be the case. And you could argue that, hey, to be manly means, I'm happy to be judged by higher standards.
Broad shoulders, yeah. Stoic.
Exactly. So you could say that's fine. And I think I would go along with that, apart from the children issue and the family courts, which has to be corrected. That's the one exception I'd make to that. But for the other things, you could say, well, men can just grin and bear it and suck it up. But the reason why that becomes acceptable, or unacceptable, is that the narrative is the opposite. The narrative is that men are privileged and have it easy. And that's what's wrong. It's the combination of the disadvantage with the completely false picture that is wrong. You see, what used to be the case, because men have always, when was it ever easy to be a man? It certainly wasn't in 1939 or 1914, was it? It wasn't easy to be a man when over 1,000 men were being killed every year, on average, in just one British industry, the coal mining industry, and that continued for 150 years. Suddenly, it's incredible. That's what men did in the past. It was never easy being a man, and yet the situation was not quite so bad in history for men because there was a certain degree of respect for it. That's what's really egregious now, is the respect for men has gone because it's been submerged under this narrative of vilification and privilege, which is simply not there. And so that's why the empathy gap has become more apparent, because the empathy gap could more successfully hide itself and make itself invisible when it was, at least there was this veneer of respect and if you like, gratitude for men's sacrifice and things like, doing the dirty, dangerous jobs and so forth. So it's the combination of the two that's terrible. But the empathy gap is still there, and so the resistance to taking on board these issues is there. So the natural evolved empathy gap is still very, very real. And of course it's now made much more virulent and much more difficult because we have a socio-political enforcement of that by essentially the feminist axis, which has a vested interest in maintaining the spotlight of concern on women and not on men, and also really promotes this, the mantras of toxic masculinity and so forth, which is powering this hiding of male disadvantage. So, and it's become very difficult for people in politics to raise these issues without being vilified. And, these issues that I've been talking about, they're all well outside the Overton window. They're well outside the the sphere of issues that can be addressed in professional political circles. Although that's beginning to change, and the International Men's Day debates in the House of Commons is a good start. So you're beginning to get these things mentioned. For example, the relationship between men's suicide and parental separation was mentioned last November, whereas it never would have been before. So maybe we're making progress.
So practically, what can be done to make the situation better?
Well, I don't think, I should preface this by saying I am a pessimist by nature, so the situation may not be as bleak as I paint it. But I don't think society will ever act to ameliorate the male disadvantages only because they're a disadvantage to men and boys. So they're more likely to act if there is a collateral effect on women, and therefore women decide to do something about it. Because women have a great deal of moral power, which is, as I said, it's ceded to them in the nature of the human pair bond. So women do, despite what the feminists say, women have a great deal of moral power in society. And so if women decide that something has to be done and this trashing of men has to stop, then we've got a way forward. But men alone, people like me, talking about it, won't drive the issue forward on its own. All we can do really is promulgate the facts and hope some of them stick. But in order to actually influence the political level, I think it's going to have to come from women. And it might, because there are a lot of women now that are sensitive to these issues. In the circles that I move in that are sympathetic to these issues, there's a great many women. It's not just men. And of course, even young women who are not well versed in these issues, I think they're finding it harder to find partners these days. They're finding it harder to find young men that want to cooperate with having children, because young men now know that they may not be in their children's lives for very long, because, hey, it's happened to their dad or it's happened to their friend's dad. We're now in the second or third generation of this, so it's becoming well known by younger people. So you can't blame young men in being reticent. So and that has a knock-on effect to young women. So maybe that's going to be one mechanism. The other mechanism whereby something might be done, and I sincerely hope this one doesn't apply, but it would have an effect, is if we have really catastrophic economic meltdown, which is looking more likely, unfortunately, and not just for these reasons. But if that happens, there will then be a focus on the basics, where you sort of enter sort of Zimbabwe territory, then the focus becomes on basics like food and shelter and clean water and sanitation and, if you're lucky, electricity. I exaggerate maybe slightly, but if the focus becomes on those basic things, then the worth of men becomes very much more evident, because those are the things that men do contribute to. So, but in the meantime, I think the thing to concentrate on is nurturing local communities which are sympathetic to these issues. If you have difficulty at the national or the global political level, then look to make progress on the very small scale, local level. And one way of doing that is through faith communities. I must say I'm an atheist myself, but I have come to the conclusion, purely through these sociological considerations, that there is a great deal of strength to be had in faith communities, whether it's, Buddhist or Christian or whatever. So that would help as well, nurturing the right sort of attitude at a local level, and perhaps other people then seeing the benefits of what they might currently regard as an outmoded, traditional sort of way of living actually has a lot to recommend for it.
Rick Bradford, thank you for joining us on British Thought Leaders.
Pleasure.